Discover the 7 signs that you think like Jesus. Most people hear a title like this and immediately assume it's about religion. But what if that's not actually the main point? Imagine someone insults you online, and instead of thinking about the argument for days, you simply let it go. Or you fail at something that mattered deeply to you, and still don't feel worthless. Most people would describe such reactions as unusual, because we compare ourselves to others, remember past hurts, and often react immediately when our self-image feels threatened. And yet there are people who seem to live by different rules. They forgive even when resentment would be easier. They treat people with respect, even when there is no advantage in doing so. You can find such people in different cultures and different eras. Some were religious, many were not. What if thinking like Jesus has far less to do with religion than we assume? What if it simply reflects a particular way of seeing people and life? Perhaps the real uniqueness of Jesus lies not only in his words, but in a mindset that continues to reappear throughout history. And the strangest part is that some of these qualities may already be part of the way you think. So the real question is not whether you believe what Jesus believed. The real question is whether you may already think more like Jesus than you realize. People love simple stories simply because they are practical. Someone disappoints us once, and suddenly we treat them as if disappointment defines their entire character. Someone writes a stupid comment online and becomes the villain within minutes. Ordering a pizza usually takes longer. Our brains constantly work with categories, good or bad, friend or enemy. For our ancestors, that was useful. Anyone who wanted to perform a character analysis before reacting to a saber-toothed tiger probably had other problems. Human beings, however, are not saber-toothed tigers. And this is where the mindset of Jesus becomes interesting. The idea is not to ignore bad behavior. The idea is to distinguish between a person's behavior and their worth. Many of Jesus' teachings point toward a different perspective. People are more than their worst moments. Someone who thinks this way often sees mistakes more clearly than others, but at the same time, they still feel that there is a human being behind the mistake. Perhaps the first sign is that you no longer define people by their worst moments. Human beings have always been remarkably good at creating rankings. Who has more money, more influence, more success, or more admiration? Apparently, the human brain enjoys creating rankings almost as much as streaming services do. Nearly every society develops hierarchies, and for a simple reason: status helps people quickly decide who deserves their attention. That is why Jesus' perspective was so unusual at the time. Again and again, he treated people of low social standing as if they were no less valuable than the powerful figures of his era. For many, this was confusing because status and worth were closely linked. But what if they are not the same thing at all? Perhaps you recognize the second sign that you may think like Jesus in the fact that titles, wealth, or influence can impress you, but do not determine how much respect a person deserves. Because eventually, you begin to notice that some of the most respectful people have no special status, and some of the most successful people are not automatically admirable. Perhaps the difference is not in how these people see others. Perhaps it is in how they see themselves. The longer you study the teachings of Jesus, the more often a pattern appears. People who think this way seem less afraid of failure. They appear less dependent on approval, and they often treat others differently from the rest. The only question is, why? What separates these people from everyone else? Why do they seem less dependent on approval? Why do they react differently to status, criticism, and setbacks? The answer often becomes visible only when something goes wrong. Psychology has been studying this pattern for a long time. People who tie their self-worth to achievement compare themselves to others more often and react more sensitively to setbacks. The problem is that this game never ends. After the next success, another standard is already waiting. It is like the familiar hamster wheel. You keep moving and still never arrive. Many people spend their entire lives on that treadmill without realizing it. Perhaps the third sign is that your sense of worth is no longer dependent on achievement. Perhaps that also explains why some people seem so different. They do not need to win every comparison or constantly prove that they matter. And from that emerge many of the qualities we have already explored: less fear of mistakes, less need for status, and greater calmness in dealing with other people. Perhaps the fourth sign is that criticism no longer determines how you see yourself. You often notice this difference only when something goes wrong. Because for most people, mistakes are more than just mistakes. They often feel like an attack. That is why we frequently respond with justifications, excuses, or blame, simply because nobody enjoys feeling like they have failed. Interestingly, psychological studies show that people learn more easily from mistakes when their self-worth does not depend on perfection. That actually makes sense, because anyone who sees every mistake as proof of inadequacy will prefer to avoid it. Someone who is secure in their own worth can examine it more closely. Perhaps the fifth sign is that you no longer need to win every conflict. Because people who do not constantly need to defend themselves often begin to define strength differently as well. Most people associate strength with control, dominance, and the ability to prevail. Someone who yields, forgives, or refuses to strike back appears weak. At least that is how it looks from the outside, especially to the person who is expecting a counterattack. Yet history repeatedly presents a different picture. Some of the most influential people were admired not because of their toughness, but because of their ability to remain calm during conflict and not answer every provocation with another one. Perhaps the sixth sign is that you begin to see strength differently. Perhaps forgiveness, humility, and compassion were never meant as strategies. Perhaps they are simply signs of something else, because the longer you examine these 7 signs, the harder it becomes to see them as separate traits. They all seem to come from the same source. People stop feeling the need to defend their worth, and suddenly everything changes. They do not need to win every fight. They do not need to answer every criticism. They do not need to constantly prove who they are. Perhaps the 7th sign is that you stop seeing people as enemies. Perhaps that is exactly why this way of thinking has continued to appear for 2,000 years. Not because everyone shares the same beliefs, but because some people eventually make the same discovery. And with that, the original question of this video changes as well. Is the question, do you think like Jesus really about religion? Because when we look back at the 7 signs, something interesting becomes apparent. None of them require special rituals, religious knowledge, or membership in a particular group. They are more about how people see themselves, how they treat others, and how they respond to life's challenges. When all 7 signs are viewed together, they suddenly seem less like rules and more like consequences. Consequences of an inner transformation. That may also explain why this mindset has continued to appear for nearly 2,000 years, simply because some people eventually make the same discovery. They stop making their worth dependent on achievement, approval, or success. In the end, one interesting question remains. If your worth was never something that had to be earned, how much time have you spent trying to do exactly that? Perhaps this is exactly why this way of thinking continues to fascinate people today. Not because it is easy, not because it is always comfortable, but because it asks a question that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. What remains of you when success, status, and the approval of others are stripped away? Most of us spend years building an identity around things that can disappear. A career can change, reputation can change, the opinions of other people can change overnight. Yet this way of thinking suggests that something deeper remains when all of those things fall away. Perhaps that is what Jesus recognized more than 2,000 years ago. And perhaps that is why people are still wrestling with the same question today. Because if your worth was never something that had to be earned, then the way you see yourself may not be the only thing that changes. The way you see everyone else might change as well.